In the quiet town of Brandon, Mississippi, nothing foreshadowed trouble on that winter day of January 5, 2023. The cold season brought with it ordinary concerns and worries, and the Gregg Smylie family was living their usual life. However, on that day, a tragedy occurred that shook not only the local community but the entire state, and later the country. In a house on Luckridge Trail in Brandon, where 40-year-old Ashley Smith Smylie lived with her husband William Smylie and Ashley's 14-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Carly Gregg, shots were fired. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they found Ashley Smylie's body with multiple gunshot wounds. The woman was lying in her own bedroom, and nearby was an injured William Smylie, who miraculously survived the attack. During the initial investigation, detectives discovered that Carly Gregg was also in the house at the time of the tragedy. Her version of events initially became the basis for the investigation. According to the girl, an unknown attacker broke into their house, shot her mother, and wounded her stepfather. However, the police immediately had doubts about the truthfulness of this story. The first alarming signals were Carly's unusual behavior after the tragedy. Investigators noticed that the girl showed no emotions that would be natural for someone who had just lost a loved one. Instead of confusion, fear, or grief, Carly behaved coldly and detachedly. She calmly spoke with police officers, answering questions without visible signs of stress. Even more shocking was the discovery that shortly after the shooting, Carly called her friend. During this conversation, she not only reported her mother's death but, as it later turned out, showed Ashley's body through a video call. This fact became one of the key elements in the subsequent investigation and raised concerns about the girl's mental state. William Smylie, who survived the attack despite serious injuries, became an important witness. After he was able to testify, the picture of events began to look quite different from what Carly had described. According to him, the attacker was his stepdaughter, who first shot her mother and then tried to kill him as well. Law enforcement also discovered that a few days before the tragedy, Carly had stolen her parents' weapon, a pistol that later became the murder weapon. The investigation established that the girl had planned the crime in advance and contemplated the details of its execution. This horrible story quickly attracted the attention of national media. Reporters and journalists tried to understand what could have pushed a 14-year-old girl to such a cruel act. Meanwhile, Mississippi state investigative authorities began a thorough investigation, gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses to establish all the circumstances of this shocking crime. In society, discussions began about adolescent mental health, access to weapons, and family relationships. The case of Carly Gregg raised many questions that needed to be answered during the detailed investigation and future trial. Before the moment when the whole world learned the name of Carly Gregg, she was just an ordinary student at Northwest Rankin High School in Brandon, Mississippi. At first glance, her life was not much different from the lives of thousands of other American teenagers. However, as was later revealed during the investigation and trial, behind this external facade of normality lay complex family relationships and internal conflicts. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will bring you more videos featuring the most shocking true crime stories. Carly was the daughter of Ashley Smith Smylie from her first marriage to a man with the surname Gregg. After the divorce, Ashley married William Smylie, creating a blended family. At the time of the tragedy, they lived together in a house in Brandon, trying to build a shared life. However, as often happens in blended families, this process was accompanied by certain difficulties and challenges. According to the testimonies of teachers and classmates, Carly was a diligent student with good academic performance. She showed no signs of trouble or serious behavioral problems that might have alerted those around her. At school, she was known as a quiet, sometimes reclusive girl who had a small circle of close friends. None of her school environment could have predicted that she was capable of such a terrible act. However, during the investigation, evidence emerged about the complex relationship between Carly and her mother. According to some witnesses, conflicts often arose between them regarding typical teenage issues, studies, household duties, leisure, and the use of gadgets. Ashley Smylie, as her colleagues and friends described, was a caring but demanding mother who sought to give her daughter a good education and upbringing. The relationship between mother and daughter became particularly tense in the months leading up to the tragedy. According to William Smylie's testimony, Carly increasingly showed signs of rebellious behavior typical of adolescence. She began to argue with her mother about restrictions on the use of mobile phones and social networks, expressed dissatisfaction with the rules established in the house, and sought greater freedom. Ashley's friends and relatives remembered her as a loving mother who worked hard to provide a decent life for her family. She was an active member of the local community and had a good reputation among colleagues and neighbors. No one could imagine that her life would end in such a tragic way at the hands of her own daughter. During the investigation, it was also discovered that Carly had been showing interest in criminalistics and criminal investigations for some time. On her electronic devices, they found a history of searches related to murders, self-defense, and firearms legislation. These facts later became important arguments for the prosecution, which insisted that the crime was carefully planned rather than committed spontaneously. The investigators paid special attention to the fact that the teenager had access to firearms. In the Smylie family home, legally purchased pistols were stored, which William used. They were kept in a special safe, but, as it turned out, Carly knew where the keys to it were. A few days before the tragedy, she took one of the pistols, which later became the instrument of the crime. During the investigation, psychologists and experts in adolescent behavior tried to understand what could have pushed the young girl to such an extreme step. They analyzed her school records, social connections, internet search history, and electronic correspondence, looking for signs of psychological problems or external influences that could have played a role in forming her motives. Carly Gregg's life before the January 2023 tragedy was filled with ordinary teenage joys and difficulties. However, behind this external normality hid internal conflicts and tensions, which ultimately resulted in a horrible crime that forever changed the lives of all those involved in this story. The investigation into Ashley Smylie's murder began immediately after emergency services were called on January 5, 2023. Detectives from the Rankin County Sheriff's Office quickly arrived at the crime scene, a house on Luckridge Trail in Brandon. The scene that confronted them was horrific. Ashley's body with multiple gunshot wounds lay in the bedroom, while an injured William Smylie was in critical condition. The first steps of the investigation included examining the crime scene and collecting physical evidence. Forensic experts found several 9mm shell casings, conducted detailed photographic documentation, and began processing fingerprints. Special attention was paid to the weapon, a pistol which, as it turned out, belonged to William Smylie and was stored in a home safe. The initial version of events was based on Carly Gregg's testimony, who claimed that an unknown assailant broke into their house and opened fire. However, detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies in her story. First, there were no signs of forced entry into the house, doors and windows remained undamaged. Second, neighbors had not seen any suspicious individuals near the house at that time. A key moment in the investigation came with William Smylie's testimony when his condition stabilized enough for him to communicate with investigators. He categorically refuted the version about an intruder and stated that it was Carly who opened fire first on her mother and then on him. According to him, that evening he heard shots from another room, and when he entered the bedroom, he saw Carly with a pistol in her hands, standing over her mother's body. When he approached, the girl shot him as well. A turning point was the discovery of a video call that Carly made with her friend immediately after the shooting. Investigators gained access to this recording, where the girl not only talked about the murder but also showed her mother's body. This fact finally convinced law enforcement of the teenager's involvement in the crime. Analysis of Carly's electronic devices, her mobile phone and computer, revealed shocking details. Her search history contained queries about methods of killing, concealing traces of crime, and legal consequences of murder for minors. Records were also found indicating that the crime had been planned for several weeks. Investigators conducted numerous interviews with Carly's teachers, classmates, and friends. Many of them expressed surprise, having previously noticed no signs that the girl was capable of such an act. However, some close friends recalled that lately, Carly had often complained about her mother, talked about wanting to free herself from her, and live independently. Ballistic examination ultimately confirmed that the fatal shots were fired from William Smylie's pistol, which was kept in the house. Carly's fingerprints were found on the weapon, which became important evidence of her involvement in the crime. Based on the collected evidence, on January 8, 2023, Carly Gregg was officially arrested on suspicion of murdering her mother and attempting to murder her stepfather. Despite the fact that she was only 14 years old at the time of the crime, the Rankin County prosecutor made the decision to charge her as an adult, given the severity of the crime and signs of its prior planning. After her arrest, Carly was placed in a local juvenile offender center, where she was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation to assess her mental state. The results of this evaluation were important for the future trial, as the defense could rely on arguments about mental disorders or the teenager's inability to understand the nature and consequences of her actions. The arrest of a 14-year-old girl on charges of murdering her own mother shocked the public not only in Mississippi but throughout the country. Local and national media extensively covered the case, often using shocking headlines and calling Carly a baby-faced teen who killed her own mother. This sparked discussions about the ethics of such coverage of cases involving minors, even if they are charged as adults. During the preliminary hearing, the prosecutor presented the collected evidence to the court and justified the decision to charge the teenager as an adult. The judge, after reviewing the materials provided, ruled that the case had sufficient grounds to go to trial. Carly was denied bail and had to remain in custody until the start of the trial. The trial of Carly Gregg began in September 2024 in the Rankin County Court, Mississippi, almost 21 months after the tragic events. During this time, the case went through a lengthy pre-trial review, during which the defense and prosecution prepared their arguments and gathered evidence. On the first day of the court session, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, members of the public, and relatives of both the deceased Ashley Smylie and Carly herself filled all available seats. Judge Steve Ratliff, who had a reputation as a fair and impartial servant of justice, presided over the process. Prosecutor John Empfinger, in his opening statement, presented Carly Gregg as a cold-blooded killer who carefully planned the murder of her own mother. He emphasized that despite her young age, the girl acted with awareness of her actions and their consequences. Empfinger promised the jury he would show evidence that unequivocally pointed to her guilt. The defense, represented by attorney Lisa Ross, chose a somewhat different strategy. She did not deny the fact of the shooting itself but emphasized the psychological state of the defendant at the time of the crime. According to the defense's version, Carly was a victim of prolonged emotional tension in the family and acted under the influence of severe stress, not fully understanding the consequences of her actions. One of the most striking moments of the trial was the testimony of William Smylie, Carly's stepfather, who miraculously survived the attack. He described in detail the events of that fatal evening, how he heard shots, entered the bedroom, and saw Carly with a pistol in her hands, how she, without hesitation, shot him as well. The jury was particularly impressed by his testimony that after the shots, the girl behaved calmly, without any signs of panic or remorse. "I was lying on the floor, bleeding, and saw her calmly take out her phone and start typing a message to someone," Smylie recounted. "She didn't even try to help either me or her mother." The court also heard testimony from Carly's friend, whom she contacted immediately after the shooting. The girl, whose name was not disclosed due to her minor age, said that she received a video call from Carly, during which she calmly reported killing her mother and even showed the body. According to the witness, Carly showed no emotions while talking about what she had done. A particular impression on the jury was made by surveillance camera footage from a neighbor's house, which captured Carly leaving the house shortly after the shooting. The recording showed her walking calmly down the street, holding a phone in her hands, without any signs of panic or stress that might be expected from someone who had just experienced an attack by an unknown assailant, as she initially claimed. Significant attention during the trial was given to psychiatric examinations. The expert engaged by the prosecution, Dr. Martin Lewis, claimed that Carly had no serious mental disorders that could affect her ability to understand the nature of her actions. According to him, the girl showed signs of antisocial behavior but was entirely sane at the time of the crime. The defense, on the other hand, presented the testimony of psychologist Sarah Johnson, who emphasized that Carly's adolescent age and the peculiarities of her psychological development could have affected her ability to fully control her actions and foresee their consequences. One of the most striking pieces of evidence was Carly's electronic records, social media messages, search history, and notes. The prosecutor showed the jury a series of queries that the girl had made in the weeks before the crime, seeking information about murders, concealing evidence, and the legal responsibility of minors. These materials significantly undermined the defense's version of the spontaneous nature of the crime. These searches indicate long-term planning, not an impulsive act, emphasized Prosecutor Empfinger in his speech. She was looking for information on how to kill someone and not go to prison, weeks before the crime. Carly herself decided not to testify in court, exercising her constitutional right. This decision caused a mixed reaction, as many expected to hear her version of events and explanation of motives. However, her lawyers advised her to remain silent, fearing that cross-examination could harm the defense line. During the week-long trial, more than 20 witnesses were heard, including police officers who first arrived at the crime scene, forensic experts, Carly's school teachers, her friends, and relatives. They all painted a complex picture of the girl's life and the events that led to the tragedy. At the end of the trial, both sides delivered closing arguments. Prosecutor Empfinger urged the jury not to allow the young age of the accused and her appearance to influence their decision. He emphasized the evidence which, in his opinion, unequivocally pointed to Carly's guilt and the premeditated nature of the crime. After a week of intense court hearings, on September 20, 2024, the moment of truth arrived in the case of Carly Madison Gregg. The jury secluded themselves to discuss and make a decision regarding the fate of the 15-year-old girl accused of murdering her own mother. The tension in the courtroom was almost palpable. Relatives of the victim, media representatives, and interested citizens waited anxiously for the verdict. The jury's deliberation lasted about 4 hours, a relatively short time for such a serious case. This indicated that the evidence was so convincing that the jury members had no significant differences of opinion. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the jury foreperson announced the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, regarding the death of Ashley Smylie, and guilty of attempted murder, regarding the attack on William Smylie. At the moment the verdict was announced, Carly stood next to her attorneys, maintaining the same impassive facial expression that had characterized her behavior throughout the trial. Unlike many defendants who display strong emotions when the verdict is announced, she remained calm, which once again confirmed the psychiatrist's observations regarding her emotional detachment. Judge Steve Ratliff scheduled the sentencing hearing for the following week. Under Mississippi state law, first-degree murder is punishable by life imprisonment or the death penalty, but since Carly was a minor at the time of the crime, she could not be sentenced to death. Attempted murder also carried a significant prison term. On September 25, 2024, Judge Ratliff announced his sentence. Carly Madison Gregg was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of her mother and an additional 20 years for the attempted murder of her stepfather, without the possibility of parole. This meant that the girl, who had not yet reached the age of 16, would spend the rest of her life behind bars. During the sentencing, Judge Ratliff emphasized the particular cruelty of the crime and the defendant's lack of remorse. He noted that the evidence clearly indicated the premeditated nature of the murder, which became a decisive factor in imposing the maximum punishment. The court cannot ignore the fact that you not only took the life of your own mother but did so with a cold-bloodedness that is shocking in its ruthlessness, said the judge, addressing Carly. Your actions after the murder, including attempting to stage a break-in and the absence of any attempts to help the victims, indicate a deep moral deficiency that poses a serious threat to society. The sentence evoked mixed reactions in society. Many considered it fair, given the severity of the crime and evidence of prior planning. Others, however, expressed concern about the severity of the punishment for a person who committed the crime at such a young age, when her mental and emotional development was not yet complete. Child advocacy organizations criticized the sentence, arguing that the justice system should be more flexible when considering cases involving minors, even in cases of serious crimes. They emphasized the need for rehabilitation, not just punishment, especially for young offenders. Ashley Smylie's relatives expressed relief after the sentencing. Her sister, Jennifer Smith, in her statement to the press, said, "Nothing will bring Ashley back to us, but today's verdict gives us some sense of justice. We can begin the healing process knowing that the person responsible for her death has been punished." William Smylie, who had not yet fully recovered physically and emotionally from the attack, was present at the sentencing. In an emotional speech before the court, he described the loss of his beloved wife and the psychological trauma he had experienced. "I lost not only my wife but also my trust in people," he said. "Living with the awareness that a person whom we accepted as a family member could do such a thing is incredibly difficult." After the sentencing, Carly was sent to the Mississippi Women's Correctional Facility, where she was to spend the next years of her life. According to information from prison staff, she was placed in a special unit for juvenile offenders, where she had the opportunity to continue her education and receive psychological help. Carly's attorneys immediately announced their intention to appeal following the sentencing. They believed that the court did not pay sufficient attention to the defendant's psychological state at the time of the crime and her ability to fully understand the consequences of her actions, considering her age. The case of Carly Gregg became a subject of discussion not only in legal circles but also among psychologists, educators, and sociologists. It sparked serious discussions about the problems of juvenile delinquency, family violence, access to weapons, and the effectiveness of the juvenile justice system. The case of Carly Madison Gregg did not end with the sentencing. The legal battle moved to the appellate courts, attracting the attention of lawyers and the public across the country. This story became a defining precedent in cases of minors accused of serious crimes. In early October 2024, Carly's defenders, Lisa Ross and James Martin, filed a motion for a new trial. They insisted that the trial court had made errors in evaluating evidence, insufficiently considered the age of the accused and her psychological state at the time of the crime. The defense also argued that the jury could have been prejudiced by excessive media coverage of the case, where Carly was called the killer with a child's face. Rankin County Prosecutor John Empfinger responded quickly, categorically refuting all defense arguments. "The facts of this case speak for themselves," he stated on October 16. Carly Gregg planned her mother's murder in advance, executed it cold-bloodedly, and then tried to conceal her involvement. On October 22, Judge Steve Ratliff rejected the motion for a new trial, noting that he found no significant procedural violations that could have affected the outcome of the case. He emphasized that the defendant's age had been properly taken into account, and psychiatric examinations had not found grounds for declaring her incompetent. Carly's defense did not stop and filed an appeal to the Mississippi Supreme Court. In the document, the attorneys expanded their arguments, asserting the unconstitutionality of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for minors. They referenced U.S. Supreme Court precedents, Miller v. Alabama, 2012, and Montgomery v. Louisiana, 2016, which limit the application of the most severe punishments to minors. The defense also challenged the decision to try the case in the adult justice system. The state Supreme Court accepted the appeal in November 2024, but a hearing date had not yet been set. It was expected that the review could take months or years, during which Carly would remain in prison. The case prompted reactions from human rights organizations. The American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU), and the Children's Law Center submitted their analytical documents to the court in support of the appeal, emphasizing the need to review the practice of sentencing minors to life imprisonment. Meanwhile, Carly began serving her sentence at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility for Women in Pearl. According to information from the prison administration, she adapted to prison life, maintaining the same emotional detachment as during the trial. She was given the opportunity to continue her school education and receive psychological counseling. William Smylie, who had recovered from his injuries but continued to struggle with the psychological consequences of the tragedy, established the Ashley Smylie Charitable Foundation to combat domestic violence and support families affected by violent crimes. The Carly Gregg case became a catalyst for discussion about juvenile justice reform in Mississippi. Legislators began discussing possible changes that would establish clearer criteria for transferring juvenile cases to the adult justice system. As of February 2025, the appeal is still under review. Legal experts differ in their predictions. Some believe the court will leave the sentence unchanged due to the severity of the crime and evidence of its planning, while others suggest the possibility of a sentence reduction with the right to parole after a certain period. Regardless of the outcome, the case of Carly Madison Gregg has entered the history of American jurisprudence as one of the most resonant cases of adolescent conviction for the murder of a parent, serving as a reminder of the dark sides of human nature and the complex psychological processes that can lead to the most terrible crimes even at a young age. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Until next time, friends.